I moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago, back when the paint on the houses still looked new and the lawns still smelled of fresh fertilizer. It was the kind of place that advertised itself with words like community and harmony, printed in cursive on brochures with pastel skies behind them. But the fine print you couldn't see was the real motto: follow the rules or find hell on earth. At the center of that hell sat Melanie Crawford, president of the Homeowners Association, ruler of the cul-de-sac, self-appointed defender of property values and suburban morality. She wore her authority like a pearl necklace, tight around her neck and impossible to ignore. The first time I met her, she wasn't really meeting me. She was inspecting me. Clipboard in hand, lips pressed together, eyes scanning my driveway like a customs officer checking for contraband. I'd just parked my truck, mud still clinging to the tires from a weekend fishing trip, and before I could even grab the groceries, she called out, "Mr. Daniels, I assume you'll be rinsing that off? Section 7C, Driveway Cleanliness. Page 12. I remember blinking at her, bags of oranges hanging from my arms, and thinking, is she serious? She was. She was always serious. For the first few months, I played along. Smile, nod, keep my head down. The HOA had rules for everything. Grass length, fence height, mailbox color. My personal favorite? Holiday decorations must not exceed 48 hours before or after designated holidays. Once, a neighbor got fined for leaving a pumpkin on his porch on November 3rd. He told me about it while hauling it to the trash like a criminal disposing of evidence. We laughed, but not too loud. Melanie's house had cameras facing the street. My backyard was my escape. I'd planted a small maple tree the year I moved in, barely taller than me then. My father used to say, plant something that'll outlive you. The maple did well. By last summer, it had spread wide enough to cast real shade. In the evenings, I'd sit under it with a beer, watching the sunset bleed through its red leaves. It was my one piece of unregulated peace until Melanie decided it wasn't compliant. It started with a letter. Dear Mr. Daniels, during a recent community walkthrough, it was noted that the positioning of your maple tree may interfere with sidewalk visibility. Please remove or relocate within 10 days to avoid violation penalties. I remember standing in my kitchen, reading it twice, trying to understand how a tree could interfere with visibility when the sidewalk was 10 feet away. I walked outside, looked at it from every angle, even stood where the mailman usually did. The only thing the tree interfered with was Melanie's sense of control. I went to her house that evening to talk it out. She opened the door before I even knocked, like she'd been expecting me. Mr. Daniels, she said, smiling the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. I assume this is about the tree. Inside, her living room looked like a model home. Sterile, symmetrical, beige everything. Even the dog on the couch looked afraid to shed. I tried to reason with her. The tree's healthy and it's on my property. It's not blocking anything. She sipped her tea, motioned to the clipboard on her coffee table. Property lines can be subjective when safety is concerned. The board has to be consistent. She said it like a judge reading a sentence. When I got home, I found another note slipped under my door, anonymous. But the handwriting was sharp and deliberate. Don't fight her. She always wins. That night I looked out my window and saw Melanie's silhouette under the streetlight, jotting notes in her binder. It wasn't an inspection day. It was Tuesday. I didn't remove the tree. 10 days passed, then another warning letter came, this one with a fine attached. $100. I ignored it. The next week it was $200. A few of my neighbors told me she'd done similar things before. Forced a retired couple to repaint their house because the shade of beige wasn't board approved. Made a single mom remove her kid's swing set for noise violations. Everyone hated her, but nobody challenged her. That's how she thrived. One morning I woke to the sound of chainsaws, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a quiet neighborhood. I threw on a shirt and ran outside. There were 2 landscapers in my yard, helmets on, sawdust flying. My tree was half gone. I shouted, "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" One of them looked up, shrugged, said, "HOA order." I could see Melanie standing on the sidewalk, hands on hips, supervising like she was directing a film. I stormed over. "You can't just cut down my tree." She didn't flinch. "Mr. Daniels, it was encroaching on public space. The board voted." I knew there was no board vote. She was the board. "You could have told me," I said, voice shaking. "I sent multiple notices," she replied, flipping through her clipboard like she was checking receipts. "You chose not to comply. By the time they were done, all that remained was a jagged stump, raw and wet like an open wound." My yard looked smaller, emptier. Melanie walked off satisfied, calling back over her shoulder, "You'll thank me when your insurance premiums go down." That night I sat on the porch staring at the stump. Every gust of wind sounded like a sigh. I didn't feel angry yet, just hollow, like something had been carved out of me along with the tree. The anger came the next day. I started reading the HOA bylaws line by line. Every clause, every amendment. I highlighted inconsistencies, found missing signatures, discovered that several of her votes had no meeting records. The deeper I went, the uglier it got. She'd been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, collecting fines without receipts, approving landscaping contracts with her cousin's company. It was all there, hidden behind official language and neighborhood apathy. I thought about confronting her, but something told me she'd just smile and file another complaint. Instead, I started talking to my neighbors, quietly at first, over fences at the mailbox in the parking lot after meetings. Turns out people were just waiting for someone to speak up. They told me stories one after another, broken mailboxes, denied renovations, fines for unsightly recycling bins. Everyone had a scar. Melanie had made enemies without realizing they might someday unite. One evening, about a week later, I came home to find another envelope taped to my door. This one wasn't official. No HOA letterhead, no polite phrasing. Just 5 words written in thick black marker. "You'll regret making noise." The threat wasn't subtle. I looked around. The street was quiet. Curtains twitched. I realized then that the war had already started, and I was the only one who hadn't admitted it yet. That night, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. The weather forecast said a storm was coming, one of those late summer tempests that rip through the valley like a warning. I stood by the window, watching the sky bruise purple. The stump in my yard gleamed in the lightning flashes, slick with rain. For the first time, I wondered if Melanie had finally picked a fight she couldn't control. The storm didn't wait for nightfall. By 8 o'clock, the rain came down sideways, hammering against the windows hard enough to make the glass hum. The street lights flickered in and out, turning the cul-de-sac into a film reel of lightning and shadow. From my porch, I could just make out the gleam of water pooling around the curb and the bent silhouettes of mailboxes. The neighborhood that prided itself on symmetry now looked twisted and alive, like it was finally breathing without permission. I stood there, beer in hand, the taste flat and metallic, and thought about how quiet it had been before Melanie moved here, before rules became religion. Her house sat diagonally across from mine, all white trim and perfect hedges, the kind of place that looked like it came with a manual. Even in the storm, the porch light stayed on. Of course it did. Through the rain, I could see her shadow pacing near the window, phone pressed to her ear. I imagined her calling the HOA hotline, probably herself on speaker, filing a complaint against the weather for not being HOA approved. I told myself to go inside, to forget it, but the sight of that stump outside my window kept needling me. Each flash of lightning turned it into a monument, a scar she'd left just to prove she could. Around midnight, the thunder moved closer. The power went out. For a moment, the neighborhood was pure darkness, broken only by the blue-white glare of the sky ripping itself open. I sat in the dim of a flashlight, flipping through the stack of documents I'd collected, emails, notices, printouts from the county clerk's website. Every page was a piece of her empire, and I could see how fragile it actually was. The next morning, the air smelled like wet wood and ozone. Branches littered the lawns, shingles scattered across driveways. The storm had passed, but left its fingerprints everywhere. I walked outside barefoot, the pavement slick under my feet. The stump looked darker now, almost black, like it had absorbed the night. Down the street, a few neighbors were already out sweeping debris, trading stories about near misses. I saw Melanie, too, in her yellow raincoat, clipboard still in hand. She was inspecting fences. Fences after a storm. When she spotted me, she waved as if we were friends. "Mr. Daniels!" Hope you didn't have much damage. Nothing compared to what you took last week, I said, nodding at the stump. She smiled thinly, the way snakes might. Oh, that... It was a safety hazard. You'll see your property value will thank me. Sure, I said. If it ever stops raining fines around here. I turned before she could respond, but not before noticing something else. A large branch, more like a small limb, had snapped off from one of the older oaks near her property. It was hanging by a shred of bark, swaying over her porch roof. She must have seen it too, because later that day, a contractor's van showed up. I watched from my window as two men in hard hats assessed it, took photos, then packed up and left when the rain returned. They didn't secure the branch. By afternoon, I got my first victory. My neighbor across the street, Clara, a retired schoolteacher with a spine of iron under all that politeness, knocked on my door. Heard you've been reading those bylaws, she said. I used to be secretary of the board before Melanie took over. She handed me a folder thick with papers, minutes from old meetings, signatures, budgets. Half the stuff she files now is fake, Clara said quietly. The treasurer resigned last year. She forged his name. My pulse quickened. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. We planned a small meeting at my house that Friday. 6 neighbors came, then 8. We spoke in low voices like conspirators. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in that street. Melanie must have sensed it, the way dogs sense storms. The next day, I found a new letter in my mailbox. Notice of noncompliance, unauthorized gathering observed. Please refrain from hosting HOA-related assemblies without board approval. She'd actually cited me for talking to my neighbors. The absurdity would have been funny if it didn't feel so sinister. The same afternoon, Clara called to say her garden. She'd had been reported for structural concerns. Someone had spray-painted rule breaker on the side. Overnight, that was when I realized Melanie wasn't just enforcing rules, she was waging a psychological war. And she was good at it. The neighborhood started to tighten again, shutters closing, voices dropping. People who had promised to testify backed out, afraid of retribution. The power she held wasn't legal. It was fear. But I kept collecting, documenting, building a timeline. Somewhere deep down, I knew it couldn't last. Tyrants always overreach. A week later, another storm warning hit the news. Heavy winds expected, the anchor said, smiling like it was entertainment. I stepped outside, felt the charged air pressing down. The sky looked sickly green, the kind of color that makes birds vanish. Melanie was already out front, arguing with the same contractors who'd left the branch hanging. I could hear snippets. You were supposed to remove it. Liability. They shrugged, packed up again. She stood there glaring up at the tree as if sheer will could hold it still. That night the rain came harder than before. Sheets of water turned the street into a shallow river. My windows rattled with every gust. Somewhere in the distance a transformer blew, flashing blue against the clouds. Around 2 a.m., a sound tore through the storm, a deep, cracking groan like the earth exhaling. I went to the window and saw it. The old oak by Melanie's house twisting in the wind, the broken branch swinging like a pendulum. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat, it looked like the sky itself was pointing. Then came the crash. A sound that felt physical, a shock wave through the ground. I threw on my raincoat and ran outside. The street was chaos. Alarms blaring, dogs barking, rain coming down so thick it blurred everything. And there, across the road, was the wreckage. The oak limb, massive and splintered, had come down directly onto Melanie's porch roof, crushing the awning and tearing through her living room window. She was outside, screaming into her phone, drenched and furious, pointing at the fallen branch like it had personally betrayed her. "This is your fault," she yelled when she saw me through the rain. I couldn't hear everything she said, just the rhythm of her voice, shrill, panicked, trying to reassert control in a world that no longer listened. I didn't answer. I just stood there watching the rain wash over the stump in my yard, over her broken porch, over everything she'd tried to keep perfect. Lightning lit the scene again, freezing it for a moment. The queen of the HOA shouting at the sky while her kingdom drowned. There was something almost beautiful about it. The emergency crews came an hour later. The branch had cracked the porch supports, but missed the main structure. No one was hurt. Still, by morning, the news had spread across every porch and group chat in the neighborhood. "Did you hear? The storm hit Melanie's house." There were jokes, whispered ones, about karma having good aim. I didn't join in, but when Clara passed me on her morning walk, she gave me a small nod that said everything. Melanie, however, didn't see it as poetic justice. The next day, she filed a report claiming the fallen branch was a direct result of neighboring negligence. My negligence. I wasn't sure how she planned to tie my cut-down tree to her damaged roof, but I had a feeling she'd try. I almost admired the persistence. It was like watching someone rearrange deck chairs on a sinking ship. The difference now was that the neighbors weren't afraid anymore. The storm had broken more than her porch. It had cracked the spell she held over everyone. People started comparing notes openly, sharing letters and fines, laughing at her absurd rules. The more she tried to tighten control, the more it slipped through her hands. And behind it all, I waited, patient as the stump drying in the sun, knowing the real reckoning hadn't arrived yet. By the next morning, the neighborhood smelled of damp cedar and ash. Crews had already taped off Melanie's front yard, and her porch sat half-collapsed under the weight of the fallen oak limb. The siding had cracked open, exposing insulation like the guts of something artificial. From across the street, I could see her in the yard, barking orders at 2 insurance adjusters. Her clipboard had survived somehow. She clutched it like a shield, as though paperwork could rebuild walls. I watched from my porch, coffee cooling in my hands, thinking about how many times I'd stood in that same spot watching her patrol the street, every weed, every mailbox, every minor infraction under her inspection. Now, for the first time, her own perfection was under review. By noon, the adjusters were gone, and Melanie's car was still sitting crooked in the driveway. The blinds stayed closed all day. The silence was strange, an absence where the constant clicking of her heels and the sound of her voice usually lived. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt something closer to gravity. Winning against people like her never feels like victory. It feels like surviving a storm that shouldn't have happened in the first place. 2 days passed. The neighborhood came back to life in its small ways. Kids on bikes again, laughter echoing where whispers used to be. Clara stopped by with muffins and gossip. "She's blaming you, you know," she said, lowering her voice even though Melanie couldn't possibly hear us. "Told the insurance company the tree fell because you destabilized the soil when yours was cut down. They didn't buy it, of course, but she's spinning." "She always spins," I said. "Eventually, people stop watching the wheel. I thought that was the end of it." But Melanie wasn't finished. A week later, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. Printed, stamped, formal. Inside was a letter on HOA letterhead demanding restitution for damages resulting from environmental neglect. Her signature glared up at me, underlined twice. I laughed, half in disbelief, half in admiration. It was almost impressive how she couldn't let go. I forwarded the letter to the board, then to my lawyer, Thomas. His reply came fast. "Ignore it. The board's meeting tomorrow. Expect resolution." That evening, clouds gathered again, heavy but not menacing, more like smoke than weather. I sat outside beneath the streetlight, watching the stump, thinking about how something so still could hold so much history. In a way, Melanie had done me a favor. The fight had turned that tree into more than just wood. It was now proof of patience, of stubbornness, of the quiet kind of defiance that outlasts storms and bylaws. The next night, the board met in the community hall, a squat brick building with folding chairs and a podium that smelled like lemon cleaner. Half the neighborhood showed up. I took a seat near the back. When Melanie walked in, there was a hush. She wore a blazer even though it was humid, her hair perfectly set, the clipboard clutched to her chest like scripture. The board chair, James Holloway, cleared his throat. "We're here to address several complaints regarding misuse of HOA authority," he said carefully, though everyone knew who he meant. "Specifically, unauthorized communications, falsified violations, and trespass." Melanie didn't wait to be accused. "With all due respect," she said, standing, "I was acting in the community's best interest. Safety concerns regarding hazardous vegetation." "There was no hazard," James interrupted, his voice calm but heavy. He held up a printout. We verified the arborist's report. The tree was healthy. The so-called bylaw 47.8 does not exist. Furthermore, you issued notices without board approval and used HOA funds for personal enforcement activities. That's absurd, she snapped. Melanie, he said softly, you were never HOA president. You were head of landscaping. The silence that followed was surgical. A few muffled chuckles broke through before James continued. Effective immediately, you're removed from any HOA responsibilities. You are to return all association materials, including letterhead, files, and funds. Further action may follow pending review. For a moment, she just stood there, color draining from her face. The clipboard dropped slightly, her knuckles whitening around its edge. Then she straightened, forced a smile that trembled at the corners, and said, Fine, but when this neighborhood collapses under chaos, don't say I didn't warn you. She left to a mix of whispers and applause. When the door shut behind her, the air felt lighter, like the house had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. After the meeting, neighbors approached me, some clapping my shoulder, others just smiling with the quiet gratitude of people who'd watched someone else fight the battle they'd been too tired to start. Clara handed me a folded note. Keep this, she said. It was a printed copy of the board's official decision, signed and sealed. For your records. The next morning, Melanie's house was dark. Curtains drawn, car gone. Someone said she'd moved out temporarily while repairs continued. Someone else said she'd resigned from the HOA entirely. Either way, her porch sat empty, the broken roof patched but not fixed, the fallen limb still piled near the curb. Every day, the garbage trucks passed it by, as though even they knew better than to touch her mess. Weeks drifted into routine again. The lawns grew wild and no one cared. The street began to look human, imperfect but alive. Children's bikes leaned against fences that weren't regulation height. Someone painted their mailbox blue. Nobody filed a complaint. One evening, I sat beneath what remained of my oak, just the stump, smooth now, sanded and sealed. I'd placed a small lantern on top, its glow soft and steady. The air was still, except for the hum of crickets and the faint sound of laughter from down the block. That was when I saw her again, Melanie, standing on the sidewalk across the street staring at my yard. She looked smaller somehow, her posture stiff but uncertain. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, I didn't mean for it to go that far. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It was thin, almost brittle. Things usually go too far when people think they can't be stopped, I said. She nodded once, eyes flicking toward the stump. That tree, it was beautiful. It was, I said. And it still is in a way. She turned then, walking slowly back toward her house. For the first time, I didn't feel anger, just the faint ache of something that had already ended. I knew she'd move eventually. People like her don't stay where they've been unmasked. A month later, a new family bought her place. Young couple, 2 kids, a dog that barked at everything. They didn't know the history, didn't care about the bylaws. The first thing they did was plant a new tree in the front yard, a sapling fragile and bright against the sky. The kids hung a tire swing before the roots had even settled. I watched from my porch, smiling in spite of myself. That evening, I walked over and offered them a hand with the soil. We worked in easy silence, the air warm, the scent of rain still lingering somewhere far off. When we were done, I stepped back and looked at the sapling, thin but upright. Give it time, I said. These things grow stronger when the wind's been rough. As night fell, the streetlights came on, casting long golden shapes across the pavement. The new tree swayed gently, its leaves whispering to the ghost of the old one. For the first time in a long while, I felt the neighborhood breathing again, not with fear, but with life. I thought about how storms come and go, how rules crumble, how even the deepest roots can be cut and still find ways to return. Before heading inside, I turned once more toward where Melanie's house stood, now quiet, ordinary. Maybe she'd learned something. Maybe not. It didn't matter. The lesson wasn't for her, it was for the rest of us. Power built on fear always rots, but something planted with patience, with care, can outlive even the loudest thunder. The wind rose, rustling through the new leaves, carrying the faint sound of laughter down the street. I raised my glass toward the stump and whispered, "Welcome back." And for a moment, I could almost swear the earth answered.